El Chapo's spectacular trial in Brooklyn came about because he refused to plead guilty or make a deal with prosecutors. So they threw the book at him. Today he was found guilty on 10 charges. Joaquin Guzman, the diminutive drug baron nicknamed Shorty or El Chapo, now faces a lifetime jail sentence.
Over a period of decades, this conviction, we expect, will bring a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. It is a sentence from which there is no escape and no return.
Guzman masterminded the smuggling of tons of cocaine, heroin and other drugs into the US, generating huge wealth. How much did he make out of it? At one point, US authorities were trying to freeze $14 billion in assets. He was also accused of murder, conspiracy and money laundering.
The cartels, I mean, we like to think of them as sort of criminal organizations on the other side of some line. They're not. They are businesses. These are very good businessmen, very astute. I think his role was to accelerate the quantities of cocaine into the United States and across Europe, to consolidate what might prove to be the last pyramidal corporation in narco traffic in Mexico.
Nothing about the events leading up to this trial was straightforward. This was the raid that led to El Chapo's capture. He'd been one of the world's most wanted and richest men. He proved difficult to arrest and difficult to hold on to as well. This muted video shows Mexican police trying to ram their way through a reinforced door, but taking so long to do so that the drug lord escaped with his mistress through a hydraulic hatch installed in the bathtub and down into an underground tunnel. And when the Mexican authorities did arrest him, he promptly escaped in the most brazen of ways, this time through a tunnel connected to a shower in his cell, and at the end of the tunnel, a getaway motorbike. His drug empire produced such enormous profits that he bought up sections of the Mexican state. The trial heard evidence that he'd offered a bribe of $100 million to a former Mexican president. The jurors, anonymous and isolated, heard testimony that El Chapo kept a murder room in his mansion on the US border with a drain on the floor to make it easier to clean up after slayings. Witnesses also claimed that El Chapo routinely drugged and raped girls as young as 13, and in gruesome testimony, his former bodyguard described seeing him beat 3 men for more than 3 hours until they were like rag dolls before shooting them in the head and having them thrown onto a bonfire. There's no doubting the terrible impact of drug wars on Mexican society as a whole. In 10 years from 2007, the number of murders there more than trebled to 29,000 a year. So will Chapo's arrest simply lead to more battles between gangs trying to divide up his operation?
There is no sign that the arrest or the extradition made any difference to anything. If anything, it made them worse. And there's no sign that his conviction is going to stop any of that. This is a fantasy. I mean, it's part of what's called the kingpin strategy of US and all Northern Hemisphere policy for decades now. You take out the kingpins, you solve the problem. Manifestly a fantasy, if not a lie.
Mark Urban. Well, I'm joined by Associated Press reporter Claudia Terrens in New York, who has been at the trial every day. Thank you very much for joining us, Claudia. Can you explain what the atmosphere was like in court? Was it an atmosphere of fear? Was there a lot of tension?
Well, I think the fear was sensed right at the beginning when during jury selection, some of the prospective jurors, some of the people that were interviewed to become jurors spoke to the judge and asked to actually, please don't make me be a juror in this trial. After that, once the jury was selected, well, we had 3 months of trial, and I think, the jury really listened to a lot of evidence. We could see them. El Chapo was there. He could see them. He paid a lot of attention to. So I think maybe that word fear would be maybe more at the beginning of it.
And tell me, what were some of the most extraordinary moments for you in that last 12 weeks?
Well, there were many, but I would say maybe we've heard about El Chapo's mistress, Lucero Sanchez. She testified, and she talked about escaping with him through a tunnel that was connected to a bathtub. This was in 2014 with Mexican Marines trying, in that home, trying to find him. She said he was naked at the time, running through that tunnel. So, you can picture all this. At the same time, there was a day in which Emma Coronel, his wife, which showed up nearly every day of the trial, wore this burgundy velvet jacket, and he was wearing a burgundy velvet jacket too. So, it made it right when the mistress was testifying. At the same time, we heard also this Mexican actor that plays El Chapo for the Netflix show Narcos Mexico, showed up in court to see the real Chapo, and he said, according to him, to be able to play him better on TV. But we heard also very serious stuff, like a witness testified that El Chapo had allegedly told him that he paid $100 million bribe to former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Mr. Peña Nieto has denied that allegation, but basically, this is some of the stunning things.
But some of the other stuff, this was a deeply violent man, and a rapist as well, a rapist of children.
Well, that part was not a part of the jury itself. We didn't hear that from any witness. That's part of what basically became part of the prosecution documents. So the jury is not supposed to have, reach a verdict on that part of the evidence. But regarding the violence, yes, there was one day in which one of his former bodyguards testified about the violence that he personally, El Chapo, carried out. About gunning, shooting at rival gang members that were prisoners, and one was buried alive, and two others were thrown, after being shot, they were thrown into a bonfire. So those things were pretty impressive. It was right at the end of the trial, too, when we had not heard about violence being carried out personally by him.
Well, Claudia Terrence, thank you very much for joining us. Let's turn now to David Weinstein, a lawyer who ran the narcotics unit for the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, and Douglas Century, co-author of Hunting El Chapo, Taking Down the World's Most Wanted Drug Lord. Thank you both for joining us. David Weinstein, first of all, we're in a situation where you have prosecuted many narcotics trials, but I wonder, where you rate the conviction of El Chapo. Do you regard this as being a major coup for law enforcement?
It certainly is, given the relations with Mexico that he had and his ability to escape capture and avoid extradition. This was certainly one of the more significant cases and arrests and convictions that we've seen here in the United States.
And tell me, we've just heard of what was happening inside the courtroom from Claudia Terrens, but I wonder, on a scale, was he perhaps one of the most vicious of drug lords that you actually know about, or there are probably plenty others, doppelgangers or whatever, or do you think this was a particularly good catch?
Well, it is a good catch, and he is one of the more violent, if not one of the currently most violent drug traffickers that we had out there. However, in the decades before, there have been other cartels which have employed some of the same violence to keep their organizations in line and in place, and this is just a continuing effort of people as they replace one another.
But do you think, when you look back at the trials you've got, the actual spider's web of bribery and corruption, you know, the police officer who's given $1 million to let a consignment through, the allegation that a former Mexican president has taken $100 million, all the networks and the blackmail and that was so extensive. I mean, did he control all that, or actually are there a lot of others in that network who have power of their own?
There are other individuals within that network, people that had to get paid off for the next payoff to work, but this is not dissimilar from what we have seen in Colombia, in Central America, in the Caribbean, where they pay money to people who are in power in order to transship their drugs through those locations and get them into the United States, and for that matter, anywhere across the globe.
Well, Douglas Sench, you just bring in you heard Claudia Terrence say, and actually it was rather awful, in fact, to hear her say that the man that played El Chapo in the Netflix series came in because he thought he would play him better. I mean, what are the myths and realities here, and how dangerous are they?
Well, I think one of the great things that the trial showed is that the mythology that surrounded him, the Netflix portrayal, was deflated. The viciousness of him, the tawdry nature of his life. I co-authored a book with the DEA agent who went through those safe houses and those tunnels. He was living like a rat in 5 or 7 interconnected safe houses in Culiacan. And by the way, that allegation that was not allowed to be presented to the jury of the rape of minors, it's in our book. They intercepted a photo array of very young girls, 13-year-olds, that he would choose. Alex Cifuentes, who was his Colombian right-hand man, would do this for him. And he's a disgusting human being on a moral level. But I think in Mexico, he had a sort of Robin Hood stature, because there's a famous song, El Niño de la Tuna, the little boy from La Tuna, who was selling oranges on the street when he was 8 years old. He became a Forbes billionaire. So that's a very enticing mythology. But his actual life, a life of brutality, a life of viciousness, of betrayal. On his mistress, as your correspondent said, was there. And I mean, he betrayed everybody, and they betrayed him in the end. So I hope it's deflated any kind of romance around this lifestyle.
But actually, is it totemic, do you think? Because we already know there are other drug cartels, Los Zetos, Menya, I think it is, who are ready to step in and have presumably stepped in already. And I wonder what actual difference it will make to the flow of drugs. Will there still be tons of cocaines coming in jalapeno tins, that kind of thing? Well,
your earlier segment was 100% right. It's farcical to think this. The appetite for cocaine in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, England, is what makes billionaires. And there's already a man named El Mencho out of Guadalajara who was already taking over a lot of the power structure. He's the up-and-coming guy. And Mayo Zambada, who is the co-equal with Joaquin Guzman, they exist, and the smuggling routes exist, and the payoffs to high-ranking officials in the tens of millions will continue. So as long as we, the Western consumer, exists to use cocaine as a recreational drug, there will be billions to be made in Mexico.
Well, and that was the other thing about the nature of the trial. Do you think it will have actually any impact? There's no kind of morality here. Any impact on people that are determined to take cocaine and other narcotics anyway?
No, I don't think that. But what I do think is that we can't lose sight of the fact is this was a historic conviction that involved the cooperation of the DEA, the FBI, a lot of American agencies that don't often cooperate with the Mexican Marines, who are called SEMAR. We're very, very brave people. So the victory is that no man is above the law. And I think that you have a prosecutor guest. I think that always needs to be hammered home, that nobody isn't untouchable. Even if they pay $100 million bribe, allegedly, to the president of Mexico, anybody can be caught. So that does make it a worthwhile
But a worthwhile endeavor. But David Weinstein, actually, whether or not it actually makes any difference on the so-called war on drugs, what do you think about that?
Well, I think Douglas hit it on the head. It comes back to supply and demand. If there continues to be a demand, the supply will continue. You can go all the way back to Carlos Later, the Rodriguez Orjuelas, the Norte Valle cartel, the people that took over. People will replace the people in order to get the supply to the people who are demanding it.
Because if you're a Colombian farmer who gets $1 an acre for barley, you're not going to grow barley, are you?
No, you're not going to grow barley unless your government works with the United States. We've tried to have Plan Colombia. We've tried to change the way that they do business and what it is they're growing.
But it's incredibly depressing, isn't it? If you are actually a law enforcement agent and if you are actually putting your life on the line to break a cartel, it's an incredibly depressing prospect if it's just going to be, one just replaces the other, David.
It's not if you work in connection with the other factors. If you go out and educate the people who are the users and get them to realize the effect that this has on all levels of society throughout. And the fact that this man was able to be captured, extradited, and escape the incestuous nature of what had existed and that allowed him to continue to bribe people, perhaps this will get the other people in government to understand that that's the way to put a stop to some of this.
And just before we finish, on that very point, Douglas Century, the idea that this was an historic extradition, it was a cooperation between Mexico and America on the eve of the departure of Barack Obama. If the same thing could be engineered again, with the Trump administration, would that be something that would make a big difference?
Well, I mean, this was historic, as David said, because of the, Pablo Escobar died in a hail of bullets. No narco of his stature has ever taken a case to trial. There were other narcos who testified against him who had pled guilty. That's generally what happens. But there was a note of sort of a political gamesmanship. I think they sent him to Trump on the first day of his administration. And do I think... Chapo's brilliance as a businessman was actually, as the trial showed, to diversify into methamphetamine. And I say brilliance, obviously, as a backhanded compliment. So it's not only cocaine. He was seeing that as marijuana became legalized, he was making less profit. So go with cocaine, go to methamphetamine. He was willing to do anything to maximize his profit. And I think that makes him probably the biggest fish that we'll ever see. No one is going to rise to that mythical stature. So if El Mencho gets extradited, will it matter? They won't make a Netflix series about him probably because he hasn't escaped from maximum security prisons twice.
Thank you both very much indeed.